Hello and welcome everyone to our latest critical conversation. My name is Hayaatun Sillem and I'm the Chief Executive at the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. And it's my great pleasure to be hosting another one of these online fireside chats that we run to explore topical issues that are important for engineering and for society. Our overarching goal at the Royal Academy of Engineering is to harness the power of engineering to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. And we've used these critical conversations to look at some of the engineering challenges and opportunities that will be crucial to addressing this goal. Back in March 2023, the government published its UK Science and Technology Framework, which set out the 5 technologies that are most critical to the UK: quantum technologies, semiconductors, engineering biology, artificial intelligence, and future telecommunications. And through this mini-series of critical conversations, we've been exploring each of these technologies in turn. For these events, I've been joined by an array of brilliant experts who have helped us to understand what these technologies are, why they matter, and what we need to do to capture the benefits and manage the risks. So far, we've covered quantum technologies, semiconductors, engineering biology, and future telecommunications. And if you missed any of those critical conversations, you can still catch up via the link in the chat. But today, we're going to be focusing on AI. I don't think that many of us were surprised that Collins Dictionary chose AI as its word of the year for 2023, as we saw a massive uptick in our focus on this critical technology, and in particular on generative AI, a phrase that many of us probably heard and maybe used for the first time last year. In the UK, we hosted the world's first AI Safety Summit, which coincided with governments right around the world intensifying their efforts to navigate the complex process of regulating and guiding the development of AI technologies. At the Academy, naturally, we wanted to bring an engineering voice into the debate. And at the tail end of last year, we published 2 rounds of interviews with diverse experts from across our network, drawn from academia and industry and entrepreneurs, both in the UK and internationally. And as a partner of the AI Fringe, we hosted a really interesting discussion about what the AI community can learn from the engineering profession on how to create a safety-focused culture. Now, 2023 may have been the year of AI, but actually AI, of course, has been around for decades. Scientists, mathematicians, philosophers have been grappling with the concept of AI since the 1950s. And AI-enabled systems and devices are actually almost ubiquitous in our day-to-day lives. So why is it that we're seemingly suddenly fixated on AI? And why are governments and businesses suddenly placing such a premium on developing and implementing AI? And crucially, are we actually obsessing about the right questions? Well, to help us explore this, we're joined by 3 experts on AI who will be sharing their thoughts, not just on why AI has suddenly become so popular and how we can build safe and ethical systems, but across a range of topics, from the UK strategic advantage to how AI could impact sustainability, inclusivity, and the workforce, as well as addressing your questions. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Simon Baker, Deborah Raji, and Professor Sana Khareghani. Dr. Simon Baker is the co-founder and CTO of Versed AI, a startup that uses state-of-the-art natural language processing techniques to provide supply chain intelligence, and which helps companies improve their risk management. He is also a Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Fellow and a Borisovich Fellow at the University of Cambridge Language Technology Lab, where he specializes in natural language processing. Deborah Raji is a Mozilla Fellow and PhD student at UC Berkeley, who is interested in questions on algorithmic auditing and evaluation. In the past, she's worked closely with the Algorithmic Justice League initiative to highlight bias in deployed AI products, and she's also worked with Google's ethical AI team and been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and AI Now Institute at New York University. Finally, Professor Sana Khareghani is a professor of practice in AI at King's College London and AI policy lead for Responsible AI UK, which is a consortium focused on creating an ecosystem for responsible AI research and innovation in the UK and internationally. Sana has worked as a software engineer in big corporations and in startups, and previously served as the inaugural head of the UK government's Office for AI, leading the team behind the UK's national AI strategy. So I'm going to kick off just asking a few of my questions to our experts, and then they're looking forward to answering your questions. So please do drop your questions into the chat at any time, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. I think first, let's start with the basics. What is AI? Okay, I'm going to have a go. AI is a broad set of technologies that to some degree mimic human intelligence or decision making. Machine learning, or ML as it's sometimes referred to, is a subcategory of AI, and it refers to models and systems that learn independently from data, modifying the operation based on their learning. Generative AI, which I've already mentioned, has been obviously attracting a lot of attention lately, particularly since the launch of ChatGPT. And that's a subcategory of machine learning. It refers to models that generate new content or data based on observed patterns and learned knowledge. And then, of course, we also hear the term frontier AI these days, and that's been adopted to describe emerging, highly capable, general purpose AI models. And the impact of AI is largely dependent on three things: the quality of the data used to train it, the design of the model itself, and how the system that the model sits in is governed. So that's my starter for 10, but now let's turn to our experts. So I'm going to start with you, Sana. What do you think our audience needs to understand about AI and its potential applications?
Thank you, Hayaatun, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with everyone. So to answer your question, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, right? AI has been around for a very long time. In fact, most of us use it every day, whether it's in our pocket AI that we carry around with us, or in the weather report that we check out, or when we search for something or shop for something online. A lot of AI technologies are being used in those kind of services. But also we have had, as you mentioned last year, a huge amount of hype around generative AI, where ChatGPT kind of swung AI technologies into everyone's face at a very mass level, and to everyone, right? Outside of research, and everyone got a chance to kind of play with it and really start to see how it can interact in a way that a lot of us are used to doing. So almost like in a chat, like a WhatsApp, you get, except you're chatting with something that isn't a person. So it was a real kind of aha moment for people to go, right, now I've got a so to speak face for something that I keep hearing about in the media. But it's important to remember, though, that these technologies have been around for a long time, and in fact, most of the technologies we use every day, we don't call AI anymore. And researchers, I hear from researchers all the time who say that it's kind of unfair because the AI we've figured out and gotten right isn't referred to as AI technology. It is referred to by its application name. The ones where we've got all these questions and question marks, and we haven't figured out how to do things yet. And there's all these worries and big fear, what I call fear fog around, that is referred to as AI. So I think it's useful to kind of remember both of those things.
Thank you, Sana. And just while I'm with you, which aspect of AI do you work on, and why should we all care about that?
So I in my career, I've coded at AI companies, facial recognition companies, early 2000s. And I worked at a company that was the precursor of Spotify. But nowadays, I'm working a lot more on the policy side of things, and AI regulation. So I'm looking at, as you mentioned, I'm a AI policy lead at Responsible AI UK, and I chair our public engagement, outreach, and policy working group, which looks at how do we help our colleagues in government grapple with the speed of change and ensure that the public voice is taken into account through the work that we do with public outreach and engagement.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sana. And I'm going to turn to you, Deb, and ask which aspect of AI you work on and why should we all care about that?
Yeah, I love Sana's description of what AI is and just sort of how diverse that category is. I think when I try to explain to people, what is different about AI, machine learning technology versus software, typical software, especially in the healthcare space, it helps to talk about data, and that being sort of a very critical difference between both technologies, where, of course, there's other characteristics, pace of development, the way in which it's deployed to automate various processes. But really, a lot of the critical difference is that a lot of AI systems are data-defined systems. So you don't have a software engineer sort of manually setting the relationship between the input to the system and the output of the system, but you have a data set that sort of like learns a relationship between that input and output. And so a lot of my research is, one, very oriented and focused on this data aspect and sort of the new regulatory policy challenges, but also the engineering challenges connected to this sort of the data that feeds into these systems. And then also, you know, when you have a data defined system, it's really important sort of what you feed that data, this garbage in, garbage out concept, where if you train a model on data that's unrepresentative or misrepresentative of certain populations, for example, and you try to deploy it in the real world, it behaves very differently than you would expect and would perform particularly poorly for that underrepresented or misrepresented population. So a lot of the interest I have is also really oriented towards evaluating these systems once they're out there in the world and they're interacting with people. How do they behave differently than what we would anticipate or how we would evaluate them, you know, when we're training these models. So yeah, very focused on the data aspect of things, and I'm particularly focused on evaluation and a form of external evaluation that we call auditing.
Brilliant. Well, we are definitely going to come back to that, Deb. But I'm going to turn first to Simon and ask you about which area you work on and why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what the fellow panelists have said. AI is more than just an algorithm. It has to have the ability to generalize, to solve problems beyond than what a particular specific task an algorithm would be typically written for. So that's essentially the definition that is widely accepted in the industry today. What I work in natural language processing, which is a major field in artificial intelligence, as ChatGPT has now proliferated around the world, and everyone now is using it. It's a fundamental interface between human and machine, the ability to communicate with it as if it were human. In fact, that was very much the basis of the Turing test when the conceptualization of AI was essentially born. Is the ability to communicate with an artificial agent, and whether it could fool you into thinking that it's another human or a machine. So it's something very fundamental to the idea of AI.
Thank you, Simon. And just sticking with the technology itself for a minute, beyond the topics that the three of you are working on, which other areas of AI research innovation do you think are going to be particularly important in the next few years?
Yes, I believe right now the trend, or at least the direction of travel, is towards multi-agent systems where you no longer interact with a single model, let's say ChatGPT. Instead, you interact with a whole network of models that are communicating with each other, that are able to specialize and solve particular tasks, and can even plan and think together towards a more complicated objective than what a current model would do. So that's one aspect that is currently very much a very hot area in AI. The other aspect is obviously multimodal AI, where you can combine signals from multiple sources of input, and that goes together as part of the same model. And that's been a big area of work for decades now, and we're seeing the fruits of it, obviously, with the latest generative models.
Thank you, Simon. We're going to struggle to get through everything we want to, so I'm going to crack on. AI has been a priority technology in the UK for some time now. So back in 2017, in the UK's industrial strategy, I think it promised to put the UK at the forefront of the AI and data revolution. Then we had the 2018 AI sector deal, then 2021 a national AI strategy. And of course, now it's one of the 5 critical technologies. But as the AI Safety Summit demonstrated, opportunities to deliver public good through AI obviously have to be balanced against managing the risks posed by these incredibly powerful technologies on both the sort of near-term and long-term timescales. So, Sana, I'd like to come to you first and ask you, what would you like to see the UK prioritise in its approach to guiding the development of AI, particularly maybe in the next year or so? What do you think are the really urgent priorities?
Thank you. I think so. It's really hard, right? Deciding kind of what to work on and what not to work on is a really important question. I think right now all of the focus needs to be on getting the regulation and the governance of these technologies right in order to aid their adoption. Because if we cannot do that, no one is going to adopt these technologies out of fear of what where liability and culpability and all of those kind of things lie. So we really need to kind of get together and start thinking about that. And there's obviously a lot of movement on that. The UK has the AI regulation white paper, for which we're waiting for the government's response on that to come back. The EU AI Act is now fully in the process of being put out there and worked on. And last year, during the Safety Summit, actually, I think on the same day of the Safety Summit, the US released the executive order on AI, which is an interesting thing as well, because it's not regulation yet. It is up to the agencies themselves to decide how to put that into play. But it is the kitchen sink, and it actually kind of needs to be. So we do need to be thinking about all aspects of this. So in terms of where should the UK concentrate? I think we're in a quite an envious place, right? We have been leading the thinking on responsible AI for a really long time. And a lot of those times we've been working very closely with our colleagues in the US. But here in the UK, we've really been driving that thinking. And so we need to continue doing that. And we need to be researchers need to be working hand to hand with regulators and with the standards agencies, so that we can define what the framework for these regulation looks like that's common across the various regulators in their various sectors, so that the regulators themselves can then start to look within their sectors and identify what's important there, working alongside standards agencies who can write the rules, so that when you're starting to put these things into place, you kind of have a playbook and go, right, I need to map these things. And if the UK can start making a move in that, I think that would be a perfect place to be. And we can start it in one or two sectors and really push adoption here. That will allow us to push adoption here in the UK. So for me, it's all about regulation, and it's about working hand to hand with the regulators and with the standards agencies to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sana. And I really liked your framing around regulation being a key enabler of adoption, because it's sometimes in the public discourse, it becomes very much about controlling. But actually, if we want to get the benefits, we need to have great and trusted regulatory approaches as well. Can I ask the same question to you, Simon? What would you see as priorities that you'd like us to be focusing on in the UK in particular?
Well, I definitely think talent in AI right now is incredibly difficult to get by, because everybody wants to get this talent, no matter where you are in the world. The government has done a great job in promoting, of course, solid education and computer science and mathematics, but we need to also do more. We need to get people who wouldn't be otherwise interested in AI to be involved. And you don't need to be a math genius to be good at AI. There are many different areas in AI right now that you don't even need to be good at mathematics. So we should really cast the net wide open. And that applies both domestically and globally, because it is difficult to get those talent. And one approach is, for example, to have a new visa type that specifically targets AI. That would be a very good move. And I know many other countries are going down that direction as well.
Brilliant, Simon. Well, I might just stay with you quickly on skills, because, of course, we think about skills sometimes in a slightly narrow sense, but AI tools are all, if you like, socio-technical systems. So in other words, they're systems where technology and people interact, and that's where the power comes from. So we need people who can straddle both the technical skills and that more nuanced understanding of the social elements of the system and the people that may be impacted by those AI tools. So I'm interested in your perspectives on how easy it is to find people with those broader skills, with those sort of multidimensional skills, as both a founder of an SME and a research leader.
Yes, it is actually quite difficult, but what I've noticed is that young people are fairly adaptable, and they have managed to pick this up running faster than any technology I've seen previously. I believe now we're going to have a new type of literacy, which is AI literacy. How do we interact with AI? How can we spot when AI makes mistakes? How can we get the right information out of it? How can we deal with the uncertainty it provides in our society? When do we take its predictions seriously, and when we don't? All of these are a new type of skill set. I would say that would prepare us for the new age. It's no longer, I would say, fashionable in both the corporate world and in society to have that sort of a knowledge sort of a stowed away in highly specialized textbooks that deal with mathematics and computer science. It's more, we'll see a whole democratization of the AI of the field, and I think that can only be a good thing. Of course, it's really important that we make it as inclusive as possible, because as we know, AI is very much susceptible to biases and susceptible to problems, because as any other tool, if you can't use a tool properly, then it could not could it be just not useful to you, but it could actually be harmful. So that's a challenge I think we have before us all.
Thank you very much, Simon. Well, let's stay with that theme, and also just to say it's great to see questions coming in. Please do keep them coming. I'm going to not be too greedy. I'm going to get through a few more questions, and then we're going to go to the audience Q&A. But staying with this theme of workforce, you raised some important issues. I wonder, Deb, if you'd like to give us a first perspective on how you think AI is going to change the skills required of employees, both for those developing AI and those working alongside it in the sort of the day-to-day implementation. Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, so, you know, the AI field for a really long time was just full of researchers asking research questions. And so a lot of the skill set in terms of those building this technology and deploying it has shifted as it became more mainstream as a product. And so, you know, you did a great job sort of mentioning the fact that, especially in deployment scenarios, sort of outside of the sandbox of just playing around with research artifacts, but when we're talking about products that are out there in the world, it does change the skill set of who builds it and how things are monitored, how things are documented. When during my time of sort of working with the responsible AI folks at Google, it was a huge sort of shift in terms of the types of, I guess, the types of education that was required of various stakeholders involved in the development process. So for example, it wasn't just, you wouldn't just need to, you know, understand the math underlying the technology or be really good as a programmer in terms of, you know, hacking away to get the best model in terms of accuracy. You would need to consider, reflect on things like the fairness of the model in deployment, how well it worked for different populations, thinking through the construction of the benchmarks that you would use to evaluate these systems so it would most closely resemble the deployment environment, reflecting on documentation and how to sort of monitor or capture you know, different types of information about the system before deployment and after deployment to make sure that the model was sort of operating in a way that was predictable and safe and accurate. You know, these are all aspects of the model development process that were relatively overlooked. And as things kind of enter the realm of deployment, people had to really reflect on, well, actually, we need to sort of expand the skill set of those that are building this technology to not just sort of hack and get to the best model on this arbitrary static data benchmark, but we need to actually think innovatively about how to evaluate. We need to think innovatively about, you know, how we document our data and how we communicate about our data. And we also need to think about, you know, the populations that are represented in this data. How do we measure it? How do we capture that information and communicate that externally so that this model is used appropriately and in context that makes sense and for populations that it's built for. So yeah, I think the skill set involved in the development and deployment of these technologies has rapidly expanded. I'll also mention, to Sana's point earlier, I think there's now sort of an appetite and interest in thinking through, you know, policies around this technology and how do we best design not just government policies, but internal sort of corporate policies around these within various institutions. So if I'm building this technology, you know, what are the sort of principles or the requirements that we would have of these systems before we deploy them? What are the things we need to check? How many stakeholders need to be involved in terms of legal requirements, in terms of other expectations from the communities that might be impacted by these systems, et cetera. So I think a lot of that policy making, policy development has evolved rapidly in the last couple of years. And that's definitely a unique skill set that hadn't really been at the forefront before, and is sort of just emerging. So lots of new things coming up for sure.
Thank you, Deb. That's really interesting. Both you and Simon have talked about diversity of the workforce impacting on the outcomes that we achieve from the the power of AI. And of course, we know that in engineering broadly, there is a significant underrepresentation of women, certainly in the UK. And we also know that there are fewer women working in the data and AI fields in the UK compared to the global average. So the Alan Turing Institute estimates that about 22% of the workers in data and AI roles in the UK made up of women versus 26 globally. But actually, the question mark around how we achieve inclusive outcomes from AI is broader than any one protected characteristic. And Sana, I think you've got an interesting global perspective on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can ensure that we are delivering for all parts of global society through the opportunity provided by AI.
Thank you, Hayaatun. I mean, I think so. Deb talked about this a little bit, right? We often think about, or we've talked a lot about in the past, the developers of AI need to be representative of the whole, right? And for much of the current past, that has not been the case. That the developers haven't been representative of the people who then start using those applications. But I think we have to start even earlier than that. The data that we use to train these models isn't representative of the population. There are, whole parts of the world, the global south, whose data we don't use at all. But actually, we don't even have to go that far, right? You can look even inside the UK. There are whole communities within the UK whose data isn't represented, isn't used, isn't being used to train any of the models that then are being used by those communities as well. So I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And there are organizations that are looking at this, enabling communities to digitize their data, to take control about what parts of their data is being shared and how and so on. But a lot more work needs to be done on making sure that the kind of, Deb said garbage in, garbage out, or the fuel for these things is representative of who ends up using it, right? And yeah, I would just say for me, the magic of this happens when you bring the challenge owners to the solution owners, right? And what I mean by that is there are experts who sit in sectors, right? Whether those are doctors or they're lawyers or, you name it, bankers, whatever. They are experts that do a piece of work and they have challenges. And often what we've done is we've had our tech people sitting in a room by themselves, figuring out, what the problems are and coming up with these solutions without having any conversation with the people whose problems they're actually solving. And so I think the magic happens is when you bring those together. So that interdisciplinary part of creating these solutions should be very much a part. It will introduce diversity just by virtue of bringing people who exist in these sectors in to help these problems, because they will then be very clear about what makes sense and what doesn't in their field. And that is so, so, so important. I think some of the problems we're seeing with generative AI, for example, is that it's trying to be everything to everyone all at once. And it's never going to be able to do that.
Brilliant, Sana. So in fact, we're back to some of the basic principles of user-centric design, which is a key criterion if you want to be doing great engineering design. Now, listen, we've got some fantastic questions coming in, which I'm going to come to in just 1 minute. I would love to, first of all, just get Simon's thoughts on this big debate around whether AI is, going to enable us to somehow achieve incredible gains for the planet, or in fact is going to be responsible for increasing the burden in terms of the energy required to power, in particular, some of the large language models that underpin GPT and so forth. So how can we have a realistic and balanced view of the potential of this technology, or these set of technologies, to support our net zero ambitions and more broadly sustainability ambitions globally? Simon, help us navigate this complicated issue, please.
Well, I mean, it has huge potential for both harm and good. I definitely am an optimist. I feel that AI can be a massive game changer, especially when it comes to things like climate change. It can come up with new solutions or solve problems that we would typically struggle with if we had conventional algorithms. For example, adverse AI, we do use AI to help us map supply chains and try to figure out, carbon risks and carbon emission in supply chains in a much more efficient way than otherwise. That is a nice application of AI. But at the same time, of course, training these large language models is quite resource intensive. And there's a whole community now specializing in how to reduce that parameter space and make it more efficient to train these massive models. Of course, these models are only going to grow larger, and therefore we have to come up with algorithmic solutions, not just build more data farms, because that is not the solution. You need a step change in the computer science behind it, in the machinery behind it, to make this more sustainable in the long term.
Thank you, Simon. I know there's so much more we could say on this, but I want to get to the audience questions, so we might have time to come back and get other thoughts on that in a minute. But I'd like to start with Martin de Hunty's question, and he's asking, it's great that the UK has been taking a leadership position on responsible and ethical AI, I think, but how do we ensure a unified global approach? So Deb, would you like to start with that, please?
Yeah, I think this is a super great question. Like I was mentioning earlier, me and Sana were both at the UK AI Summit, and I thought it was a really incredible event, bringing together digital ministers from around the world and those working on the policy side of the AI conversation across the world to interact, and kind of we had been in maybe Zoom calls together, but very few of us had actually met in person. So it was a great opportunity for that kind of interaction. I'll say, on the UK side, on the US side, sorry, Sana had mentioned, so the US AI executive order came out on the Monday of the same week of the summit. I think the summit was on the Wednesday, Thursday of that week. And so there was a lot happening that week internationally around this conversation. And I think what we saw at the summit was that there's different countries that have different approaches, but everybody agrees that government has a role to play. And I think right now we're at a point where, because the conversation on AI policy is actually much older than people think. It's much older than ChatGPT. And so, 2014, 2016 era, there were a lot of these sort of AI strategies and, AI sort of like principle statements coming out from various countries and companies. And I think we're entering this era, post 2021, where governments are realizing that they should actually do something practical. And so, in that era of like more high level thinking on this, I think there was a lot of on the surface agreement, like we need transparency, we need safety, we need to address discrimination concerns. But I think now that we're entering sort of a world where people are discussing laws or discussing enforcement, we need even more sort of precise guidelines coming at the international level in order for implementation to be aligned. So, Sana was mentioning the importance of the standards making bodies, which are these international bodies that will be really critical in defining what our expectations of these systems should be and translating that into technical requirements. There's also, sort of the typical international organizing bodies. The UNGA has this AI advisory board that's going to come up with guidelines that will hopefully inform national action and enforcement. OECD has these AI principles. The G7 has this Hiroshima AI principle. So they're coming up with guidelines at that international level, but it's really up to the different nation states to interpret that and translate that into legal requirements. And I know in the US in particular, there's a lot of hope to being able to shape that global conversation so that there's coordination and alignment at that national level, because it becomes very tricky if we're misaligned nationally.
Thank you. Gosh, Deb, this is a huge question. I'm sure, Sana, you want to come in on this, but can I ask you to link it to David Wright's question, which is, can AI governance ever realistically keep pace with the pace of technology change? Do we need to be realistic about this? In fact, this is an arms race and we are living in an ungoverned AI world with bad actors. Sana, what are your thoughts on that?
I hope so. I mean, so I think that the short answer is, tech moves very quickly, right? And traditionally government has not, and that is a very fair assessment of a kind of the norm. But that's not necessarily the the kind of end of it, right? Right now, what's happening is there are 2 more safety summits that are going to happen this year, right? And then after that, they will be every 6 months or annually or whatever it is that the community is going to decide. But the point is that there will be now, hopefully, some learning from all of the history we've had with, whether it be the internet or the advent of a lot of these other kinds of technologies that we've had to live with, the kinds of market disruption, the way that companies have vertically integrated, all sorts of things that we have never really in the past kind of dug into, that are being looked at. And I think these will have effects on how these technologies move forward. Not only that, there are also these things called the safety institutes. So there are 2 safety institutes now, one in the US and one in Canada, one here in the UK. And there will be likely others announced soon in terms of those that are coming. And this is about bringing the best of the best into government, and making sure that the scientists and the ones who are researching into these areas are helping government do this horizon scanning and stay abreast of what's happening. So the idea is that, yeah, I mean, it's a really fair question, but I guess I'm an optimist, and my hope is that we will start to put in place the kinds of standards that will help us stay ahead of the bad actors. I also just simply believe that market dynamics mean that if you don't do things well, people don't come along with you. And so if we don't get the governance of these technologies right, they won't be adopted. And so, I think there really is a crux point. This is likely to be the last year of the Wild West, in my opinion.
Really interesting, Sana, and some great questions from the audience. Please do keep them coming. I think I'd love to pick up on that last point you're making around adoption. And sometimes I think we worry too much about the idea of, kind of being automated or AI stealing our jobs, right? And in fact, if you look at the UK, as a kind of system, probably the bigger risk to jobs is failure to adopt technology that will help us be more productive and more efficient. And so there's a couple of questions here that are really to do with adoption. We've got Robert Ball asking, how can individuals support the adoption of AI in the UK? And we've got Marcus Kane asking about how we can build confidence for deploying AI in healthcare beyond the basic radiological interpretation tasks it's already being used for. Simon, you're trying to get your technology into supply chains, and trying to get this deployed in the real world. Do you have reflections on how we can encourage confident adoption of technology that exists today and can be delivering greater benefit if we adopt it at larger scale?
Yeah, I'll answer the question from John about the sorry, not John, from Marcus about the healthcare. It is an important attribute of a modern AI system for not only it has to be correct, but it needs to be explainable or interpretable in a meaningful way. So what we face from our clients, that it's no longer okay just to give the right answer. You need to explain why you give that answer, and you need to provide traceability all the way to the raw data of how an AI managed to make that decision for you, or how to make that prediction for you. That is I think is a massive step forward in allowing AI to be adopted widely, because once you can understand its reasoning, once you can understand why it makes that decision, you will start building trust, or you can spot mistakes and then of course take mitigating action. It's not really too different from human beings. Like if you had a friend who gives you an answer and the answer is confusing, and you don't just walk away with that answer, you'll ask them why you arrived at that answer. This is no different. We need to build systems that are a lot more explainable, that gives us reasoning behind the output that they generate. So that's fundamental, I think, going forward. It's no longer okay just to be 98% accurate. That even if it's high accuracy, we've been burned too many times by very, very accurate systems, at least in the lab bench, and then when we go to the real life, they don't perform that well because it's impossible to consider all of the situations you might put an algorithm in a workbench.
Thank you, Simon. It's a really clear explanation of why explainability is so crucial for confidence and adoption. Sana, I'm sure you've got thoughts on that too, but I'd also like to throw in a question around actually what should we be considering when we engage with really young people? What should we be teaching in schools, bearing in mind the fact that we're trying to map onto a future that none of us can quite visualize right now? So Sana, feel free to throw in some thoughts on adoption, but I'd also love to get your ideas around what we should be teaching the next generation.
That's a nice, easy one. So I appreciate you throwing that one at me. But let me address the adoption question first. I mean, I kind of think of the adoption question as it's kind of it has two facets to it, right? So there's one, which is what we've seen so far, where companies kind of tell a few people and they say, go sit in that room and figure out how we can add more AI to what we do. And they never do a good job, right? Because that's like asking a few people to go inside a room and then innovate and come up with some sort of new AI product, right? Because it's not magic dust that you just add on top of things. You have to really think through your challenges, and you have to think through what technologies you need for those challenges. You have to think through what data you have, and then, and so on and so forth. There's a process involved in that. And it isn't just kind of those people sitting in a room by themselves, right? The second part is there's a huge number of tools that are out there and deployed and being used now today that help each individual become just more productive on their own, and entire companies become more productive. It just the kind of their day-to-day, their desk work. And in that kind of a place, I think the company needs a policy around what they use and how they use it. And then they need to give a little bit of freedom to people to kind of experiment. And I guess my answer to the person who said, how do we help adoption happen? I think just start using some of the things that exist on your Pocket AI, right? You can talk into it and it writes out everything you say. It's brilliant. You don't ever have to type anything in your phone again. And it gets to know you better and better every time. Your emails are pre-written for you pretty much nowadays. There's lots and lots of things, or Duolingo in terms of the applications that teach you how to, learn a new language, right? No plug there, but there are others as well, right? The point is, go out and experiment with some of these things. They're really cool in making you feel more productive. And then to answer your other question, which I'm going to try and get out of in a way, by saying that it's really, really hard, right? And it's really hard to know what to do and what not to do. I spoke to a very prominent thinker in AI, and he said to me, do you know why nobody has done this on the East or on the West in terms of changing the curriculum? Everyone knows they need to do something, but the reason no one's done it is because any change you make today, you won't see the effects of that for 30 years. So who is going to be the one who says, right, here are the changes we need to make? I think there needs to be some incremental things, right? We need to really err on human traits, like problem solving together, understanding challenges, figuring out what tools we have to help us get to the next step. So not trying to reinvent the wheel. History is a big one, but who knows?
Love it. And in fact, what you're describing is what we might call engineering habits of mind. So those fundamental principles around, how do you identify a good problem? How do you then apply creative problem solving approaches? How do you visualize? How do you improve? So those fundamentals hopefully do endure. Well, I'm going to switch topics now, and there's just so many questions I want to try and get through. So Deb, I'm going to give you Tony's question. So apologies in advance, it's not the most straightforward. How do you envision establishing a certification framework for AI applications to ensure both safety and ethical considerations? And I think, this is something we're all wondering about, like, how will we know that this is good AI? So Deb, can you help us?
Yeah. Also, just to very quickly react to Sana's points around education, because I'm still sort of in my education phase of my journey. I think something that would also really help is just ethical awareness and engineering principles. Actually, a lot of what the engineering field has already contributed in terms of documentation and rigor of the process is missing from the culture of machine learning. Again, this was like a research community in computer science that we didn't have norms around documentation, around looking through pipelines, around some of the engineering integrity work and engineering ethics work that's preceded us has not been part of our education formally, and are things that I had to learn outside of that. System safety these are all ideas that are very comfortable for engineers, but missing from computer science curriculum. So that's something that definitely I would have appreciated learning more formally. And then, it also connects to this question of certification and what makes a good AI system. Something that I think we're figuring out is that it's really similar to what makes a good, when I give talks, some people like discussing about AI as if it's sort of like a sentient anthropomorphized being, as if it's a toddler that we don't know how to control. But it's much closer to like a toaster, And so what are the requirements for a toaster? How does certification work for a toaster? Well, you have like really clear specifications and requirements. You have an evaluation protocol. You're able to compare, the reality of what you're witnessing with the system versus these expectations that you've articulated for that system. And then you test compliance. You see, like, does this built system, this engineered artifact, match our expectations for that system in order for it to be certified, or in order for it to be appropriate to be used for, a set of approved use cases. And that's really how we should start thinking about AI systems, is that's much closer to a toaster than it is a toddler. Of course, there's differences between, ChatGPT and a toaster, given just like the general purpose nature of the technology. There's unique challenges to AI versus other types of engineered artifacts. But even when it comes to something like, specifications and thinking through specifications for this technology, setting standards, and then being able to evaluate in relation to these standards, a lot of us that are sort of in the auditing space in particular are looking at that as the very next sort of frontier of how to actually get to any kind of certification or licensing scheme for this technology. We have to be able to articulate what our expectations are for these systems in deployment. Simon mentioned that, when we were evaluating these things sort of in lab, it looks great. We're getting 99% accuracy. And then we throw it out into the real world and it behaves very differently from how we would anticipate the models to behave, or how we would anticipate the models to perform. And so we need to actually just invest in sort of thinking through, like, what are actually the differences between this deployment scenario and how we develop these systems? What are the evaluation practices that we need to adopt in order to better anticipate the behavior of these models in deployment? So I think a lot of the research and a lot of the science around, a lot of the evaluation science around these technologies are pretty underdeveloped. And so the idea of a certification scheme is really difficult to sort of wrap our heads around at this point. But a lot of it hinges on standards development and specifications, and being really concrete about what are these requirements for this next generation of technology. And I think a lot of the UK AI Safety Institute, and I'll speak, I guess, like definitely in the US, which our US AI Safety Institute is currently sort of located within the National Institute of Standards and Technology, because there has been such an emphasis on standards development as sort of the critical piece towards any kind of certification. And I'll also mention, because I think sometimes when I mention or I talk about evaluation, people are a bit confused because they're like, what does this have to do with ethics or safety? But there is a really strong connection. If you can understand how well these systems behave, if you can be really clear about your expectations for how well these systems behave, you can figure out if it's appropriate to deploy in scenario A or scenario B. You can talk about the risks involved in deploying it in different scenarios, and you can talk about the risks to different populations that might be impacted by these technologies. So I think that's a really critical aspect of things, just sort of standards development.
Thank you, Deb. Well, it's very reassuring, and I love your description of AI being closer to a toaster than an unruly toddler. But I suppose there is a category of concern that we haven't actually addressed in terms of this part of the discussion, which is deepfakes and misinformation. And I wonder whether, Sana, you've got any thoughts specifically on what are the tools at our disposal to help build confidence of how we navigate a world where it's so hard to understand the genesis of what we're seeing and consuming. So Sana, I'll start with you, and then Simon, I'm going to come to you as well. Just heads up that we're getting towards the end of the session. So I'm going to ask you at the end of the session just to give you a moment to leave the audience with one big takeaway from each of you. So just to kind of get the brain cells warmed up. But Sana, how do we navigate this world of misinformation and deepfakes?
I mean, I think this is a really important part of the question, and a scary one, given that more than I think it's more than nearly 2 billion people are going to polls this year alone across the world in terms of elections and so on. So I think this is a really big worry, right? There's a lot of work and research happening on this right now. So looking at the provenance of data, looking at the provenance of pictures. There's digital watermarking. So Google's DeepMind came out with some stuff around this. There are other organizations working on this. So there are technical solutions. Definitely, there are solutions that have existed for a while, which is, your trusted kind of media sources all have fact checking that runs alongside. And I think if for the time being, until some of these things pan out and we have much more, we can take legislative action, and there's much better tools and things out there for us to use. I think for the time being, people need to be vigilant. You just need to check. Don't believe everything. I mean, my advice to my own parents is, just because you see it or you hear it doesn't make it real anymore. You need to look it up, go and search, talk to other people. Don't just take it as read because you've seen a video or you've been sent something. Make sure that you can corroborate that from other sources. So I think for the time being, just a level of vigilance until more kind of proper action is taken on it.
Thank you, Sana. And Simon, I'm sure you've got thoughts on this as well, so I'd welcome those. And also, we're coming towards the end, and we haven't talked much about innovation actually. And I'd be interested in any perspectives you have on how we can make the UK an even better place to be running an AI startup scale-up business, so that we can actually positively encourage that innovation to flow through into value in people's lives. Simon, you might have some comments first of all on the deepfakes, misinformation, certification, watermarking, that category, if you'd like to.
Yes, it's I second what Sana has mentioned. This is a very much an open question in the community right now. It is very technically difficult to avoid all types of deepfakes. Although there are certainly plenty of people working on this problem, we are far away from an obvious solution. I think the way we should approach the age of AI, the same way we approached the age of the internet back in the 90s with cautious optimism. We shouldn't be scared of it, but we certainly shouldn't just adopt it in its entirety and assume all is good. So there will be a period of turbulence and bumpy ride until the right legislation is in place and the right safeguards are in place as well. Regarding the what we could do to promote the AI sector and how to essentially increase the adoption of this tech. First of all, the UK is really does punch above its weight when it comes to AI. We have a highly concentrated pool of talent, and that alone will help attract additional talent because you won't really find this in many other countries. And I can speak from experience. One thing I believe we could really help improve the AI sector as a whole is outreach, further outreach in schools, further outreach in the community, further outreach to not necessarily the younger generation, but the older generation, and teach them how to be safe with AI. I feel that's probably the best way we can demystify a lot of the nonsense you might see in tabloid articles about what AI is and how it spells the end of humanity. I don't believe that's the case. I think there's a bright future ahead of us, and we should probably make the most of it.
Brilliant, Simon. Well, that sounds like that is your takeaway, but if there's any other last point you'd like to add, I'll give you the chance. Otherwise, I'll go on to the others.
Oh, that is a good takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. So, Deb, I'd like to come to you and say, what's your takeaway for the audience? Final thought.
Yeah, I also just to add a little appendix to the deepfake conversation, because this is a conversation that's really brewing in the US as the elections are coming up next year. We have the sort of Real Elections Act that was introduced by Senator Klobuchar just a couple months ago. And I think something that has been part of the conversation in the US that I wanted to raise here is that people really focus on detection as the sort of key question for deepfakes. How do we detect these systems? But there's not really legal consequences if you're caught, disseminating this information. I don't know if people are familiar with the Taylor Swift case recently, even if it's sort of non-consensual deepfake images. And so now there's been a really big push for that. Daphne Culler at Stanford has a great article called Awful But Lawful, where currently disseminating this kind of misinformation and deepfakes is completely legal. And so without legal consequences, it's hard to change behavior. And I think that will be my takeaway, which is that we just need more legal regulation and consequences for those that decide to misuse this technology, or those that don't kind of follow through in terms of due diligence before they deploy these technologies in potentially high stakes scenarios. And that's a lot of what I'm curious to see in the futures. Responsibility and accountability for those that are building these systems and making use of them inappropriately.
Brilliant. Thank you, Deb. And actually, I think Dame Wendy Hall was making a similar point on the radio at the weekend. I heard her, and just reminding us that sometimes we feel that this is, something incredibly difficult to understand, but frankly, making things that clearly should be illegal is a starting point that most of us can relate to. So really important takeaway there. And Sana, what's your takeaway for the audience?
Is I'm gonna stay away from regulation and stuff, because I feel like both my my colleagues on the panel have covered that really, really well. So I guess my takeaway is going to be that this is a really exciting and interesting world that we're living in, and these technologies are very exciting and interesting. And if you have questions, there is a huge amount of information out there, and I think sometimes that's the reason people don't start to listen. But just pick a thing and start listening, and get involved. And for those of you who are already working in AI, make sure you look up Responsible AI UK and reach out to us, because it would be great to join you up with what else is happening in the UK. So I'll leave you with those two takeaways.
Fantastic. Well, we've managed to end on an optimistic note. I am one of life's optimists, so I believe in active optimism. So not sort of sitting back and waiting for good things to happen, but rolling our sleeves up and trying to make sure they happen. And each of our panelists, I think, has been a brilliant exemplar of that. So I would really like to thank our fantastic panelists for responding to such an array of questions so thoughtfully, and also to all of those who submitted very, very interesting and stimulating questions. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. AI is already a huge part of our lives, and on the current trajectory, it's going to become ever more so. And I hope that today has provided you with some insights into the technology behind the hype and the very real issues and benefits associated with what I think is, for once, not an overclaim, a truly disruptive technology. So if this conversation has sparked your interest, or if you have further comments about today's events, please do respond to the survey that's been posted in the chat. We'll email it to you as well, and we really appreciate your feedback. This discussion is the final installment in our tour through the 5 critical technologies, but we're in the process of planning a new series of critical conversations for 2024. So stay tuned for updates on our LinkedIn page. And if you've got topics you'd like to suggest, then drop them into the chat. And if you want to visit the back catalogue of previous events, you can catch up on all of those via the link in the chat as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a really good evening. Goodbye, everybody.